So much, DJs are here on the decks. Hi, everyone, and welcome to LCOY Webinar 2. My name is Simpiwe Masilo, and I am very happy to be your facilitator for today. But before we get started with webinar 2, we had webinar one, about 2 weeks ago. And I think for those that weren't at webinar 1, just a quick recap might be a little bit helpful. So webinar 1, understanding the G20, the Y20, and the U20. What exactly is that? What are we doing? What's going on here? And essentially the conversation of how as young people we can all work together towards using these different streams now that we understand them, and working together to building the LCOY youth position using the understanding that we built from G20, Y20, and U20. So the G20 decisions, they affect our daily lives, from how much we pay for transport, and yet most of us don't even know how to engage in these spaces. And that is a lot of what part of the conversation the G20 was last year. With the U20, there are 4 priorities as the U20 that are there, which are economic opportunities and financing, climate action and urban resilience, social inclusion and equity, and digital transformation. If you are looking for more information on this, it is on the LCOY's social media. And you can definitely find it in the highlights. And then finally, we also looked at the Y20, knowing that a lot of young people face a lot of insecurities within South Africa, and seeing how the Y20 can assist them, especially in the key actionable areas, such as climate change, environmental sustainability, and inclusive economic growth and employment pathways. Essentially, if you weren't here for the first webinar, you missed out on a lot. But you are here for the second one, which is a good thing. Starting with our first speaker of today, Hannah. Hannah Hopper is a dynamic sustainability and youth development professional with expertise in international diplomacy, education, and corporate sustainability. Oh, I'm so sorry, guys. I made a big mistake. Before I got too excited and I wanted to introduce our speakers, but before that, I'm going to hand over the mic to Andile to do the overview for LCOY.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for that, Simpiwe. My name is Leanne, and I am the co-focal point for Local Conference of Youth South Africa, LCOY in short, which is a youth-led initiative under YANGO, the official training youth constituency to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's a lot, guys. But we're here and we're making it happen. This is basically a global platform that empowers young people to shape climate policy, amplifying our voices and drive action, not just locally, but also internationally. LCOY brings together young people, young change makers, to discuss climate issues, co-create solutions, and ultimately draft a youth policy document. Now, with over 100 plus approved LCOYs worldwide, South Africa is proud to be a part of this global movement. And with this movement, every country or each country focuses on themes relevant to its context, and the outcomes contribute to a global youth statement submitted to the United Nations climate conferences, such as COP. So yeah, for 2025, the theme for LCOY South Africa 2025 basically is derived from South Africa stepping into this pivotal role where it assumes the G20 presidency, where South Africa assumes the G20 presidency. We then as the LCOY team asked ourselves, what does it mean for us as the youth? And that's where we decided to look at the just transition and local governance and exploration of the urban. And these topics reflect the urgent need to ensure climate transitions are fair, locally driven, and inclusive of all realities we face in our communities, especially in urban and peri-urban areas. Our goal is to engage youth voices across South Africa, build capacity, and ultimately co-author a youth policy document. And this document will be shared with national and international stakeholders as part of the mission to influence decision-making at all levels. So through such webinars and creative engagements, we all gather inputs that reflect lived experiences. So for us, LCOY is not just about climate conversations, it's about building intergenerational equity, advancing climate justice and creating a space where young people are not only heard, but trusted as solution makers. And with South Africa leading on the global stage in 2025, now is our time to step forward with bold and youth-driven visions. So whether you're a policymaker or partner or passionate youth, I am excited to have you guys on board and to be part of this journey with us. And I hope that together we can make LCOY South Africa 2025 a launch pad for action, inclusion, and sustainable change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andile, for that beautiful message. And now back to the excitement that I was experiencing prior. Our first speaker for today is Hannah Hopper. She's a dynamic sustainability and youth development professional with expertise in international diplomacy, education, and corporate sustainability. Her key engagements and leaderships are co-chairing the Y20 Summit for South Africa 2025, Young Ambassador Society Delegate for UN 69th Commission on the Status of Women, and the Agenda Committee member, World Youth Development Forum. There is a longer list, but for the sake of time, Hannah, I now present the floor to you.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to join you all this evening. And thank you to the organizers of LCOY South Africa 2025 for creating this powerful space for youth dialogue, reflection, and action. So as mentioned, my name is Hannah Hopper, and I have the honor of serving as this year's co-chair for the Y20, and I'm also the chair of South African Youth for International Diplomacy. So let me begin by expressing my deep support for this webinar series and for the broader LCOY South Africa process. These spaces are essential for shaping bold, inclusive, and locally rooted climate solutions. You are not just participants in a conference, you are policy shapers, community leaders, and catalysts for just transition. Your work will feed directly into global processes, including the U20 and Y20, amplifying your voices where they are so often missing. As many of you know, the Y20 is the official youth engagement group for the G20. It brings together young people from across the world to discuss, negotiate, and present policy recommendations to G20 leaders. It's a space where youth are not only heard, but expected to contribute meaningfully to some of the most complex global issues. South Africa holds a very special role in this process. While we remain the only African country within the G20, the recent inclusion of the African Union as a permanent member marks a historic shift towards more representative global governance. Together, we carry the hopes, perspectives, and priorities of this continent. As we prepare to host the Y20 in 2025, alongside South Africa's G20 presidency, we are working to ensure this is not only the most inclusive Y20 in history, but also the most transformative. That means grounding global conversations in local realities. It means amplifying voices of historically excluded communities and ensuring that young people are not only included, but empowered to lead. To me, strengthening youth voices for just transition means more than simply offering young people a seat at the table. It means equipping us with the tools, networks, and trust to build our own tables and to bring others along with us. One of the ways that we as the Y20 2025 are putting this commitment into practice is through our recent open call that we issued to young people across South Africa and the continent to join our thematic area working groups. This call is now closed, and we're processing a diverse group of individuals and organizations that are working in youth development who will collaborate closely with this year's South African Y20 delegation. Together, they will contribute research, shared lived experiences, and bring critical perspectives to the policy development process. This collaborative model will ensure that South Africans' policy recommendations are grounded in a broader and more representative range of voices, anchored in local realities and reflective of the priorities of young people across the continent. By bringing diverse perspectives to the table, we recognize that addressing the ecological crisis cannot be done in isolation from structural inequalities that perpetuate it. A just transition is not only about decarbonizing our economies, it's about transforming the systems that have historically exploited both people and the planet. It means rethinking who has access to land, energy, education, and opportunity. It means dismantling systems of exclusion and building regenerative alternatives that are rooted in care, equity, and community. And that transition cannot happen with young leaders. Your understanding of your communities, the fact that you bring solutions, technologies, and different ways of thinking, and more than anything, you bring the urgency and the moral clarity that this moment demands. At the Y20, our mission is to create a space where these voices are not only elevated, but translated into tangible policy recommendations that G20 leaders can act on. Our success in 2025 will depend on the strength and diversity of young voices from across South Africa. So I encourage each one of you to stay engaged, stay bold, and stay connected. Your voices matter, not just to this process, but to the future we are all trying to build together. Thank you for the work that you do, and thank you for letting me be a part of this journey with you.
Thank you so much, Hannah. I know that all of us opening our mics to give a round of applause might be chaotic. So if we can give a virtual round of applause to Hannah, please. See all the claps going up. Really appreciate your message of support. A few key takeaways that I noted down from what you were saying was speaking on how Y20 uses the voices of the youth to inform the G20 and G20 leadership, and that we cannot work in isolation. We need to work together, and we need to be able to be trusted and given the tools and network to build our own table. And our next speaker, I think, has managed to work really hard to use the tools and networks around him to build a table big enough for other young people to sit at. Irfaan Mangera is an activist, organizer, human rights educator, and community builder. He's the head of education at We the People South Africa, with the core responsibility of deepening knowledge and understanding of the South African Constitution, and has an extensive career in youth mobilization, working to ensure youth voices are at the center of public discourse. Irfaan, I kindly pass the mic to you.
Thank you all so much. Appreciate the introduction, and thanks to the co-chair who's from the Y20, who I also am part of as the PR and media officer. I was briefed for a 20-minute session, so I'm going to start immediately because I suspect I'm not going to be able to go through a lot in depth. So good evening. It's an honor to be with you all, and a special mention to all the organizations who's hosted this, and the team behind the organizations who put together this important discussion amongst the many other work and workshops that you'll be hosting. The theme was set out as youth in the heart of the just transition, and to move away not simply from protest, but to policy influence and building power. I wanted to root this in how the climate crisis is local, and all of you already know this. I don't think I'm speaking to an audience that doesn't understand that all experience, including development programs and projects, happens at a local level. Business happens at a local level. Our education happens in some local context. And so it's not an abstract idea, but a very localized idea. One that we have to reckon with, whether it's the air we breathe in Mpumalanga, in Bahlenle, the heat waves in Uppington, it's the grave and often life-threatening floods in eThekwini, and the waste and pollution in Mamelodi. Those are day-to-day experiences that ordinary communities are going through and are saying that this is issues that affect us. They may not have the language and tools available yet to describe it as the climate crisis, but that is our job as the advocates and activists and people who are invested in wanting to build a climate just future, to do the work necessary to bring those communities along with us on this journey for transforming society and making sure no one is left behind. Now, what are the youth voices and where do we place ourselves in that context? A lot of work is already being done. Many of your organizations I've already led in policy spaces. Some of you may be new, but young people are not just a voice. you are part of a community, you're part of a family, you're part of a country. And if there are those here who are outside of South Africa, you're part of a nation and a globe and a continent of people who want better, of a generation that is yearning for something new and for something different. And therefore, we have to be visionaries. We can't simply act from a position of not knowing what is it we're fighting for, or the type of society we're fighting towards. And I want to say this by asking us to think about what does that reimagination look like in your heads? Because for me, real inclusion is not just around being at the table and whether that table is fit enough to actually host us and be inclusive of all of our differing and diverse voices, but making sure that that table is met and that reimagining is met with actual tangible and measurable policy influence and budgets. Because sometimes partly in the discussions we have is that we fight and achieve the policy, but then the follow through to get it budgeted is often forgotten. And so youth-led solutions have to be what drives us in this process. I later will mention YCAP as one of those in the city of Johannesburg. Many of you in this webinar were part of that process, influencing the city of Joburg to adopt the Youth Climate Action Plan. That is a youth-led contribution that has actually been adopted, and we have to then think about how do we keep up the pressure in order to make sure that that's a document that doesn't just occupy dust or get further and further down someone's email chain. We have to actually be the ones who keep up that pressure and therefore move beyond just what we're seeing in the current form. And that leads me to these platforms that we've been speaking about, Y20, U20, LCOY. I just got back from a climate summit in Brazil. All of these, and I think my frustration is growing by the lack of thinking that's going into medium and long-term processing of these engagements. It's absolutely important to have them. It's absolutely important for us to convene and share the knowledge and share in this exchange of co-creating policy and co-creating new forms of thinking. But beyond that, what is the next steps? And that's often where I'm finding a lot of the things are falling short. I'm actually quite excited that the Y20 has adopted one of its key policy highlights or key outcomes is that they want to create a Sherpa council. I'm saying they, but it's actually we, a Sherpa's council in which we can track and trace the progress made of the policies that we've advocated for and pushed through within the G20 space. And that Sherpa's Council then is there as a body to make sure that accountability happens and that oversight is happening over implementation. And so I'm excited about that as one area of moving towards something new rather than just having us as a side event and we're ticking a box. For me, these are platforms that allow us to actually build strategic power. We need to think about what does it mean for collectives to start forming, think tanks to start forming, youth caucuses. Many in the chat I saw earlier introduced themselves as, either founded an organization or are leading in one or are working for one. That's actually a good start, because what does that mean is that we have influence. We have the power to actually exert pressure where necessary. These platforms give us that ability to start connecting. And I think the one good thing about this year is that the global eye is on South Africa. And so we can potentially showcase something new in how we organize and how we work collaboratively with other young people. Everyday power looks different. For some, it's, I just want to work on policy. For others, it's, I'm going to run for office. Some of us been there, tried that, may still do it, but not sure yet. But because this is speaking about local influence and local transitioning, I want us to draw on processes that exist within the current democratic landscape that allow us to actually go and make our voices heard. Most of the time, young people are not present when cities are hosting their IDP sessions and meetings in different regions of the city, or when they're engaging in budgeting processes. Now, the integrated development plan is really how the city decides on what are the key priorities for the next 3 to 5 years. How do they budget for it eventually? And so not having your voice there makes it difficult. And so how do we then start applying pressure in those scenarios, in those sittings? There was a good case about 3 months ago in which young people actually got to the table and refused to go. And while the politicians and political parties were mobilized, tried to collapse the meeting, ended up being outside of the actual venue, the young people remained resolute, even though it took hours for the meeting to start. And they were the only ones there who remained till the end, who could influence and contribute towards shaping the IDP. And that is partly how we think about, you know, what it takes, what are the sacrifices required to actually sit through this hard process. And if we want to achieve that final outcome, that final vision of a society, what is it that's going to take from us collectively to make sure that happens? And I speak in collectives, and I speak as building power collectively, but at the end of it, it's also a deeply personal process. You have to work on understanding how much of your own power are you willing to share and contribute in shaping this new society and this new vision that we want collectively. You also don't need to wait for permission to participate. If any of us had waited for change to happen, we would not be here today. And so no one's going to give you power, and no one is going to give you change on a platter. If you want it, you have to fight for it, you demand it, but actually you have to do the work to actually get there. I'm going to try to fast track this because there's a page that is really important, but local government is where it hurts and where it heals. It's where our houses exist. It's where our social organizations exist. It's where our religious and interfaith communities exist. And so that's where it's most visible. That's where the injustice around climate is most visible. And so how do we then use the municipal tools available to us to then start shaping it? And I've mentioned a few. Another big opportunity that's legislated for is that petition processes have to be responded to, whether it's provincial government or local government. There's an actual committee that has to sit and process every single petition that comes through each council. We have the power to use that as a mechanism. And I know there is fatigue around it, but fatigue does not negate the fact that because the process exists, we can actually use it in our favor and start turning things around and applying pressure from all different sides. And therefore using local space as a form of, or as a site for struggle around climate justice. For me, and partly why I accepted to speak today, is because this new role empowers me to teach people about the power of this booklet, the Constitution. And often we take for granted the fact that it's a progressive one because it's not delivered upon. But delivery doesn't happen by book. Delivery happens by people. And what is a tool and in our arsenal is using this book to fight for our struggle. And so I've just highlighted in this slide a couple of areas in which climate justice can be used to fight for in a very robust legislated way. Yes, outside of Section 24 around environmental rights, we speak of the intersection on climate and housing, on water, on health, on education, on food, hunger. And these are legislated through the Bill of Rights, through our Constitution, to make sure we demand from our government, demand from our leaders, regardless of which color they wear, that they have to actually respond to the needs of the day. And this means that we actually have some power. And around the world, it's constitutional activism and lawfare has been used. I don't think we've leveraged enough, given that we've not amassed enough resources, but I think it's an avenue to explore as far as local elections coming up next year, where are the sweet spots in which we can start opening up and getting public interest law firms to support us, and many of whom do have these progressive views similar to us. Additional to that is the Constitutional Court and using the judicial system. Because we've signed the Paris Agreement, we have a commitment that is signed and pledged by this country and this government. And so there's another area of doing accountability and transparency work to make sure that litigation is in our favor. I'm wary of time, but the next slide speaks about active citizenship as a tool as a climate justice tool. But what is the citizenship? It looks different for all of us in this room. If I have to ask any of you, we'll all have similar but differing answers. And that's because we all show up differently in our day-to-day lives. The communities we come from and the socialization that happen informs how we show up differently. But the baseline is that it's about participation, recognizing that you're not simply yourself in the society, but you form part of a broader collective, and that it's a sense of duty. What duty do we have to our fellow citizens, and whether or not that duty is premised on this idea of solidarity? Again, all values that are encapsulated in this constitution, knowing that we are protected because people once upon a time stood up and decided to fight for something that they didn't even get to see. Many of whom had died in the struggle for this democracy to come about. But what, outside of trying to honor legacy, how do we honor ourselves and the generations that's coming after us? Because that is the more difficult question, is whether we're doing the right thing so that the generation after us actually benefits from the work that we do today. And that's the kind of citizenship that I think we need to move towards instead of the type of reactionary approach we've seen over the years. And again, it's not new to South Africa that people are growing disinterested and disillusioned by systems that govern us. Some of these big systems and the global system, in fact, has been designed in such a way that it limits equal and inclusive participation. But that doesn't mean we have to stop in our own advocacy, because part of us gathering here today is knowing that there is some form of hope. Otherwise, we wouldn't show up. There's 60 of us in a room, 60 of us who can potentially grow into becoming advocates for changing the system into something different, and potentially becoming ward councillors and or other forms of global advocates on the climate justice movement. Another part of being an active citizen is knowing who are the people in charge of making the decisions on the day-to-day. And often we don't pressure and fight them enough. Yes, the system is geared up without giving them enough power to act on certain things, but that shouldn't negate us from doing accountability work. Your ward councillor was elected by you, your family, your community, people in your street. You have every right to make sure that councillor attends a meeting, even if that meeting is in your house, to make sure that they understand what the climate crisis is about and what it's doing to affect the community. And you have studied or you have experienced these sessions, and you have the tools available now to actually go out and demand better from them. They may not know some of this content that we're speaking about, and you actually may develop an ally by working closer with them to start dealing with projects. Somebody mentioned pollution earlier. It's working and developing this type of solidarity and connection with people like ward councillors, like the people sitting on your street committees and civic space, that will actually help you to mobilize further and potentially open up some resources to help. It's not always the case. A lot of the time it's a very territorial space, but there are ways to do that. And again, it's by creating a nurturing space that allows for collective learning, knowing that this person may be hostile because they feel threatened. And dealing with that threat means you have to disarm people like that. And I'll give you a quick example before I move on. When we fought for the Lehigh Library in the south of Joburg as a means to make sure young people have access to education and internet, etc., we got fought by the councillor, as well as young people who belong to his party. But we knew that those young people will also benefit from the actual project of the library opening, whether it was through jobs or whether it was through having access to the internet and a learning space, because there's no high school in the area. And over the engagements we had, the meetings we had, the dialogue we created with those young people, we suddenly turned those young people on our side, and therefore shift the power dynamic in the community, making sure that a lot more support was suddenly placed on our side instead of the side of the corrupt councillor. And so if there's not enough time, but if there's talk about tactics that you want to explore with me, I'm happy to take that outside of the meeting. Key policy directions I've just noted that I think should be considered or thought about, at least, that these are just something from a personal lens that I've been thinking about. But we had the YCAP, for example, in the city of Joburg. How are we tracking the implementation and the budgeting of that climate action plan? The second is creating youth climate advisory boards. This is happening in some parts of the world where they have very progressive response to climate crisis. But how do we legislate those within council so that these boards have powers to do oversight work, whether it's to the water bodies or to defunct water bodies at that, because most in the country are, but also do monitoring so that there's a pipeline for accountability that can be built into the system. A Just Transition Youth Community Fund for under-resourced areas. It's something that I think will benefit young people to become active agents within their communities, but also help with the transition process. The Komati plant, for example, is an area in which people are being left behind, and fancy slogans are not going to help them put food on the table as shifts happen. So it's an important part to make sure that there's money where many of us are speaking about the change as well. Constitutional climate literacy in schools and youth spaces, part of making sure democracy works and that power is put into the hands of the people, is that people actually have the information and tools available to equip them with the fight. 51% of this country actually only know that there's this constitution, and what some less actually know what's in this constitution as far as the rights afforded to ordinary citizens. That is an actual research stat that came about through government research working with the civil society actors. And it found that because of that, how do you expect communities and families and individuals whose rights have been stripped from them, whether by mining communities or by mines or by private business or even by government, how do you expect them to fight back when they don't have the information and tools available? And so an investment really has to be made into that kind of work. And accountability for non-compliance. Given that it's a G20 year, how do we make sure that we reprioritize climate action, given that following year is going to be in the hands of an orange guy who doesn't really like us from this part of the world? But how do we make sure that there's more legally binding agreements and checks that are able to actually galvanize and hold accountable world leaders who fail to act on promise? Yeah, and this is the last slide to just say, we are not leaders of tomorrow. None of you are. You are already leading in every space you are. You own organizations, you attended these types of events. It makes you a leader. But a leader is somebody who recognizes that we have to chart a path and a vision. And part of that is making sure that we not leading ourselves alone, but we're bringing the people we know with us along the way in the journey. You can't just simply lead yourself and call yourself a leader. And so your families, your friends, your schools, your NGOs have to be part and parcel of the conversation with clear demands and making sure that you keep centering the people in the struggle for this transition. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Irfaan. I think a lot of us got quite a bit from learning on how climate crisis is local. Once again, if we can just give a virtual round of applause. Thank you again. A lot of what was said, I think, ties back to what Hannah was saying about us working together as a community. Again, we are leaders, and therefore it is part of our responsibility to ensure that we're not only working in silos, but we're bringing people along with us, and we are ourselves mechanisms of accountability. And one thing that was mentioned from what you said was also looking at how we get law firms that are obviously public interest law firms to support in what we're doing, which is how I'm bringing in our next speaker, our last speaker, Leanne Govindsamy. Please correct me if I am pronouncing your surname incorrectly. Leanne is the head of Just Transition at Southern Transitions. She's a human rights and environmental lawyer with 16 years of legal experience. She has experience in working to advance social, environmental, and climate justice through law and policy reform, strategic impact litigation, research, and advocacy. She's a former head of the Corporate Accountability and Transparency Program at the Center of Environmental Rights as an activist lawyer organization in South Africa. Again, Leanne also has a very extensive bio. So again, for the sake of time, Leanne, I now pass the mic to you.
Thank you so much, Simpiwe, and thank you to the organizers for the invitation. It's a real privilege to join you guys today. And yeah, I think just reflecting on everything that Irfaan has said, it's really important for us to sit together and come up with strategies, ways of working that enhances the participation of the youth in either local, regional, or global processes. And when it comes to advancing the just transition and being able to implement either legislation or, you're thinking about the Climate Change Act here, and of course there's been a delay or a deferral in some of the regulations, it's really important also to contextualize what this all means in people's ordinary lives and to almost break up the problem into a couple of little pieces and work out where can we be most effective in addressing them. And one of the things that I was thinking about quite carefully in thinking about what is some of the most useful interventions that could be made as it relates to just transitions in urban areas or more broadly in relation to the just transition. And I thought adaptation is an important piece of work to focus on. So, to go one step back, of course, we want to build climate resilience. And, my apologies if I'm repeating information that you're quite aware of, but, in the interest of ensuring that, the information is as simplified as possible and also accessible, let me take a couple of steps back, right? So we want to ensure that we have climate resilient societies. It can involve mitigation actions, which, is about bringing down coal-fired power, etc. And, related to that, you've got to have phase in, phase out strategies. But a critical component of that relates to adaptation. And adaptation really speaks about how do we ensure that we are capable in communities, in various geographies, of responding to climate events, right? And so what adjustments need to take place either at an ecological, social, economic level in order to respond to either ongoing climate impacts or expected climate impacts, right? And so when we're thinking about adaptation, it could range from anything. You're thinking about flood defenses, early warning systems, drought resistance as it relates to crops. And a key issue that I think lies before us now is the Climate Change Act has come into place, and South Africa must now look at what is our national adaptation strategy going to be. And I will post this into the chat maybe. It's from Chapter 4 of the Climate Change Act. And it speaks to developing adaptation scenarios, developing a strategy. And my apologies that I don't have a presentation, but I thought I would share this so long. And over the next year or so, we have to be actively working on this adaptation strategy and figuring out what does this mean for people living in coastal areas, inland areas. What does this mean for rural versus urban or peri-urban areas? And it's very interesting to think about adaptation, but from a just transition perspective, because we are so centered around just transitions related to mitigation. That is coal-fired power, what happens to communities in coal-affected regions, that I don't think we've developed enough of a language for speaking about fair resilience and fair adaptation. And this has been quite a topic of discussion at a UNFCCC level, right? Where, you know, in relation to various COP events that have taken place, and I'll put a link into some of the documents there. But essentially, we have to start thinking about adaptation. What does fair adaptation mean? And when we're thinking about at a South African level, how do we feed into South Africa's national adaptation strategy? It cannot be that we are developing the strategy at a national level, because adaptation inherently happens at a local level. Yes, there must be engagement by local government with national, regional, global actors in order to ensure that there's financing for adaptation, there's sufficient financing for adaptation, that we have access to climate technologies, that we're thinking about innovative solutions, we're learning from different regions, so small island states, other developing countries who are facing similar issues. But adaptation is fundamentally local. And we have to, wherever we are based, be thinking about what does this mean in my community. So, for example, when the floods in Durban happened a couple of years ago, this relates to the rain bomb that occurred there, communities were left in distress. I think it is about 400 people that died during those floods. And to date, people have not, for example, been rehomed, right? And this is years later. And even though there was some efforts by the city to try and prepare for that, it just simply wasn't sufficient. And what you then saw happening is communities themselves trying to develop their own adaptation measures, where they would track the levels of the water, for example, and say if it breached a certain level, they needed to evacuate. They developed their own modes of communication. So they had WhatsApp groups, they were able to deploy people into areas where maybe people didn't have access to signal, for example, actual cell signal, right? So that you had a strategy to move older people out of the area, because during the floods themselves, a lot of older people with disabilities were trapped in the mud. So it wasn't necessarily the water, but the actual mud that resulted in a lot of people dying there. And so what did we learn from that example? One, that there is so much more preparation that is needed, and that preparation has to be driven by very local solutions. And people need to be connected. So there's a communications aspect. And the other is that sometimes you're thinking about adaptation in a way that factors in time to recover from a flood. But in Durban, what we've seen is that there has been no recovery time. And so you haven't been able to see adaptation measures being put in place. So how do you develop climate resilient societies when you consistently have to face those impacts, right? So my plea to you all, or one of my many pleas, is when driving or participating in South Africa's national adaptation strategy, engage at a local level around what's going on. In urban settings, things like heat stroke, impacts on health, people being able to access, disabilities, and what does access mean, that becomes really important. Water, sanitation, all of it cuts across, but in urban settings, there's a different type of adaptation that's needed. Also think about the role of technology and what that can mean in driving innovative solutions to address a communications deficit when there is major kind of climate events, right, weather-related events. And bring those ideas to the fore, because this is not just about how do we influence policy and bring in and of course I fully advocate for ensuring that you're taking a human rights lens, that you're bringing in the constitutional provisions, that you're looking at just transition in the context of national commitments, global commitments, etc. But we are facing a problem of there being a lack of innovation, a lack of ideas in how we respond to some of these issues. specifically in relation to adaptation. And so that is something where if we had the ability to convene at a local level, gather those ideas, gather concerns, gather the solutions, because it is those very people at a local level that are going to implement those solutions and engage in our national adaptation strategy. And quite importantly, if there are going to be regulations, there's going to be a national adaptation strategy, a provincial one, a local one. We need to ensure that language related to the just transition makes its way into some of those local plans. So the idea of what does fair adaptation mean also speaks to who owns the implementation of adaptation measures. When you think adaptation, you think you're building walls at coastlines and there's going to be some private company that's going to come in and implement adaptation measures at a coastal city. But adaptation takes many forms, and the implementation or the adoption of nature-based solutions as being key to adaptation has to be considered in our national adaptation strategy. But we need to take it one step further and say, if you introduce an idea of fairness, that means communities must own some of those solutions. So let's say, for example, and there are examples of this in Indonesia and other parts of the world. Let's say, for example, that a key adaptation measure at a coastline is mangroves. Got to ensure that happens. Or in Durban, right, it's protection of key conservation areas and corridors. Durban has an adaptation strategy, and it flags this issue of the corridors. Is it a corridor that is managed by, let's say, Ezemvelo or Sam Parks or something like that? What is the role of local communities in that area owning some of those solutions, benefiting on an ongoing basis from those solutions? So if people were, for example, having to ensure conservation of a mangrove because it delays the rate at which floodwaters rise in an area, are they being paid for that? We have to ask the questions around benefit sharing, community benefit sharing, as it relates to adaptation measures. And this can apply in an urban setting as well. But again, I ask, who is coming up with the ideas? Who is proposing new ideas and coming up? You could have innovative ways of communicating in a community where, there is no cell signal, for example. Are we actively trying to develop those and propose those and come up with tangible, real-time ideas? So, sorry, I'm not sure how much of time I have, but I wanted to maybe just take this to one kind of level above and say, Simpiwe, how much time do I have so that I can just manage myself? About 5 minutes, I think.
3 minutes left.
Okay. In the same way that I have highlighted how adaptation at a national level, there needs to be participation, we need ideas, we need to think about fair adaptation. The same applies at a global level. So, the G20 context is about consensus building versus UNFCCC and the COP, which is negotiation. So consensus building, negotiation, but if you highlight an issue in one concept in the G20, it is built upon in the COP 30 to be precise here. And so I want to share a link to 2 documents. The one is a submission by Yango, actually, on the Just Transition Work Program, which is a UAE work program. And the other one is by C40, so the cities kind of grouping. And what's really interesting here is that you've got 2 submissions to the Just Transition Work Program at a UNFCCC level, but it draws from local experience, and we're thinking about how do we adapt at a local level. And it's really important for us to reflect on how do we ensure that the solutions that we come up with, so let's say we convene we gather, we influence South Africa's national adaptation strategy through local solutions, etc. How do we translate that into participation at a G20 level and then participation at a UNFCCC level? Because you still need the local solutions to be unpacked at whatever kind of layer of intervention you're involved in. But I'll stop there, and I really thank you for your time, and I hope that's been useful.
Thank you, Leanne, so much for all of that. Again, if we could kindly please give her a virtual round of applause. I see there's some hearts there as well. I think there's a lot of information that came through, especially on how do we ensure that when we're adapting locally, we're also coming up with the solutions that help us in our context. And I think the example of KZN and the different geographical landscapes where people live in South Africa was really great in terms of how do we think about localizing adaptation. And I think it also goes back to a lot of what Irfaan was also saying about us working together in communities. And also, again, to what Hannah was saying again about us working together. I think the running theme that we're seeing in today's webinar in terms of climate justice is ensuring that we actually work as a community. And as young leaders here today, I think we can also challenge ourselves to try and answer the question that Leanne posed to, who is coming up with the solutions for adaptation, and how do we as young people come up with solutions to adapt within our own communities at that local level. We're now going to enter into our Q&A. I see that our chats are loaded with some comments and questions. As you see, Leanne has shared the 2 links that she spoke about. So if anyone does have any questions, please feel free to pop them on the chat. Alternatively, you are more than welcome to start raising your hand. All 3, Leanne, Hannah, and Irfaan, are still on the call, so we can see if we can get some answers for you guys. Are there any questions? I'm trying to see if we have any hands. In the meantime, while people are still nervous, I'll just go through the chats for us. Oh, we actually have a hand. Govindsamy, you may unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay, thank you so much, Simpiwe, for the opportunity. Thank you to every presenter who have done a presentation. It was lovely. I really enjoyed each and every presentation. But I have a concern, especially from something came up in my mind while Irfaan was doing his presentation. He mentioned something along the lines of active citizenship and in the IDP processes and all that. So my question is, how can we evolve these IDP processes? Because the current setup of them, especially the public consultation, I don't really think that it is meaningful. As in, like, the views of the community are being really considered, because sometimes they do these IDP, they do collapse. They do collapse, and then you ask yourself, how did the budget pass? Because the communities didn't really have input in this IDP and the budget processes. So I think, yeah, we really need to the processes of the IDP really need to evolve in such a way of really mainstreaming climate change. Because if you can really have a look, the challenge is mainstreaming climate change as a crisis. You see, if you can check the recent budget, there is political debates and so on, but it doesn't speak anything to climate change, as if climate change is not a crisis, or it is not stated anywhere in our national ambitions. So yeah, my question is, how can we evolve the IDP processes at the local level? Because these processes, they start at the high level, at the council there, in the public consultation. It's just a tick box exercise. There's no meaningful consultation and so on. So how can we evolve such that issues of just transition and climate change become mainstream even in our local IDP processes? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Govindsamy. Irfaan, before I let you answer that question, I'm going to just read out the question that's in the chat. And considering that the first question was directed to Irfaan, I'm going to direct the second question to Leanne. And the question is, based on the discussions, what are the key policy recommendations that LCOY South Africa 2025 should propose to the U20 to promote a just transition in urban areas? So Irfaan, the first question was for you. Second question, Leanne. Irfaan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Govindsamy, as well for the question. It's something I've grappled with for some time, because I think in proposing reforms, we must think about how do we best build into the system a fair and equitable and accessible process. One for me is digitization. It's not the be all and end all. Let me just frame it that way, because you might not have internet access in certain areas and so on. So there's challenges around that. But what I think brings about better participation, and I've always worked from this principle, is working with people from where they are. As young people, where are you based? Are you on the sports fields? Are you in the Shabins? Are you in school? Are you in wherever you may be? You could be at the club at Groove. How do you make it easy for people who are regularly accessing these spaces, who may also have views on issues, but are not finding these once event-based IDP sessions accessible? How do you make it accessible for them? And so there are enough opportunities through technology and digitization, but what that must be coupled with has to be dashboards, live active dashboards that can be accessible. So when you as a young person, as Govindsamy says, in my area, I know there's a budget of R1 million for this ward, you need to be able to see it somewhere. And that means, is there a website that has a tracker of, this is the R1 million, this is what it was spent for, this is what it's budgeted for, etc. So you can also measure the performance of your councillor and performance of your local committees. I want to also add a big challenge that I have with government often, because of how politics happens in the country and globally. A lot of the time people act on misinformation and disinformation out of self-interest rather than data-driven, fact-based solutions. And so how do we create mechanisms for real-time data? Do we have regular surveys in the community that can help inform, okay, this is when the floods are happening, this is how we can mitigate this, this is the type of streets that need maybe infrastructure upgrade for the drains. This area might not need infrastructure upgrades, but might just be an opportunity or space to grow a food garden. And so that type of data and evidence-based planning helps from an urban planning perspective to also put in place mitigation mechanisms that can address some of the issues. I also want to say that we have to reimagine what participation looks like beyond just a meeting of a community called for by a councillor. People's power really is beyond that. It's you as 20 young people in a community could gather together and say, okay, what are the key issues we want to be fighting for the next 6 months? And that kind of town halls, political school workshops like this, where you can, it doesn't take too much to organize, is a form of participation that can help influence. I mean, we can even use the WhatsApp groups you have. Most communities and street committees have WhatsApp groups. There's community radio. Those are all places for engagement that we could drive input, collect data, and help that inform, particularly in a way that is inclusive, because you might also find in IDPs, some of the venues are not accessible for disabled people. And so going to the people's homes could be another process, the same way we do and collect our data for the annual the census. So there are many different options available. It's whether or not we have power to influence and pressure those in power to actually start applying this new thinking, some of these new ideas, and also testing them. And we're not saying it's the be all and end all. We have the ability to express this interest and these ideas to professionals who can also help us craft the best way forward. Lastly, it's IDPs alone won't, in processes alone where inputs happen, are not going to solve the problem. We have to make sure that the full input all the way to outcome is measured. And therefore, in these sessions, and that's why I'm saying access to information is something we take too lightly. We need to make sure that there's at least websites at the very basic level that define KPIs or measurable outcomes for each of our cities, for each of our regions in the cities, so that we can monitor and actually hold them accountable towards those measures. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Irfaan. Leanne, can I pass the mic on to you for your question?
Yeah, thanks, Simpiwe. I will run through a couple of points here. Sorry. So I think, and thanks, Courtney, for that question. On key policy kind of recommendations, one of the first things that needs to be paid attention to in urban areas, and how do we ensure that this happens at a local level, is there has to be an alignment of funding. So, I've spoken a lot about adaptation, but it's not just alignment for funding at so national level kind of allocates, and then you have funding at a local level, etc. But there has to be a constant review and a loop back system, because circumstances are changing on the ground, and you have disaster response and you have that kind of thing, but it simply isn't going to be enough to say disaster response is going to solve a particular thing. There needs to be kind of more innovative finance solutions to addressing what is needed at a local level, and how do you ensure that there are benefits for communities in urban areas, right? So if you're thinking of not just phase out strategies, but phase in strategies, and you're thinking about local economic diversification, I think it's important to define what that means in an urban setting and what that means for the most vulnerable. So if you're thinking about waste pickers, or you're thinking about, ideas around food security, for example, there's an example of groundwork that has this really interesting partnership with the eThekwini municipality on waste pickers, and it's a zero waste strategy, and there's elements of kind of moving waste in particular ways, but also aspects of biofuels, and it's a really interesting project if you want to have a look at that. But define what that means in an urban setting. So you can have policy recommendations that speak to how the format of the policy, what it achieves, etc. But then you have to have other aspects of it that contain substantive recommendations. So again, define what fair adaptation and resilience means in an urban setting. What does it mean for health in an urban setting? But I think quite importantly, we can't get away from the fact that network infrastructure, be it water or electricity, whatever it may be, it's one of the most important things that we need to address at a local level. And we haven't been able to get that right. And so being able to get the very basics right, and then being able to build on that, so looking at a particular area and using it as an example when you're making policy recommendations is always really effective. So yeah, those are just some of the ideas I would have there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Leanne. Courtney has once again prompted everyone on the chat that if you have any additional questions, please feel free to throw them there. Otherwise, I'm going to be opening the floor again for a round of hands. We're still feeling nervous. So we just read what we have in the chat so far. Penelope asked on this and on Leanne's point of, well, on this being Courtney's previous point and Leanne's point of funding, public-private partnerships could be leveraged more to mitigate for shortcomings and or lack of resources from a public sector perspective. It's not a silver bullet, as introducing private sector participation in local municipal objectives bring other considerations to think about, but a blended approach like this could provide resources that are lacking and as such hindering the transition. Irfaan agrees, we need to innovate and relook at urban funding models. Most of the population lives and works in urban centers, and not adapting to this reality is harmful to growth. And would also really emphasize a drive towards greening our cities through urban farming to curb the hunger crisis, as well as ensuring our townships can be redesigned to incorporate better transport services and greenery. Irfaan, I note your hand is up. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I just wanted to add, like, I think particularly from a South African and Joburg context, right, is townships were designed to be very exclusionary spaces. Many of us come from them, we live through them. And so we understand when cities have not adapted to it and mitigating against the harms of access. And I know a lot of you speak about intersectionality, and that must be rooted in some of the proposals put forward into the G20 space, because transport access is a big challenge. Most working class families who come from townships are spending most of their money they make already very low paying work on transport. And so that can be solved. So more pressure on that side of things. I think greening communities, most townships were not designed for wellness and well-being. And so you see it very dusty, and there's good imagery now. I think lots of activists have been using AI to showcase, possibilities of what like Soweto could look like should it be filled with trees and that type of stuff. But I think that also helps shift deal with another issue of mental health. And so I think there must be that kind of pressure points together with hunger. I think I raised it earlier as one of the key things I'd focus on, because in as much as South Africa exports we have really good agriculture, like farming systems in place in most of our other provinces. I think urban farming hasn't been explored enough to curb immediate hunger challenges. And because we have such a challenge with homelessness and so on, it could be a very effective policy for cities to adopt space for urban farming. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. I think also just going on to that point, and also the point of private sector assistance with the just transition, as young people, especially if, let's say, I'm living in a rural area or a township area, what's the best strategy that can be used to actually get private sector to assist with the plight towards a just transition? So that's my question. I'm not directing it at anyone, so if anyone wants to take it, it's for you. And then I'm just gonna allow Boa to please unmute themselves and ask their question, and then read the question on the chat, and then allow you guys to answer. So Boa, the floor is yours. You are unmuted. We cannot hear you, however. In the interim, I'll read the question that's on the chat, and if you can also maybe type it out or try again once I've read the question. So the question in the chat is for Leanne, and it says from Lundi, who asks, could you please define what climate adaptation phase in and phase out process looks like at a local level? Bauer, can I try with you one more time to see if it works? No. If possible, can you please just type your question out in the chat? So the first question, just an open-ended question, either Irfaan or Leanne can answer, on how as young people, especially living in areas such as townships or rural areas, how do we best approach private sector to assist us? And then the second question is for Leanne. So I'm going to allow Leanne to take the floor first because the second question is directed to her.
No, thanks for that question. I wasn't meaning a phase out and phase in strategy specifically to adaptation, but it relates more to mitigation, right? That we've focused so much on the phase out and, you know, phasing out coal, etc., that we haven't spent enough time on what do the phase in strategies look like. And it becomes quite complicated when you're thinking about that, because at the end of the day, I'm sure you've heard, especially maybe at the Climate Commission meetings, people talking about replacing the coal economy, for example, and that happens in specific geographies, but that also happens at a very local level as well, where you have economies that are built around a particular industry. And so those phase in strategies can be, how do we ensure beneficiation as it relates to critical minerals, for example, and how do you ensure that we don't repeat the same mistakes that we've made previously in the mining sector? Or how do we think differently about adaptation that can be regarded as a phase in strategy, because it's something we're doing to ensure climate resilience, but it's also something that's building an economy around itself. So where people are owning nature-based solutions and benefiting from it in an economic way, how are we thinking about that? And that economic diversification, it takes on so many forms, and we need to think quite carefully about how do you do that with what you have in specific areas, because every area lends itself to a variety of economic activities, but it also needs to link international priorities and be driven and supported at that level as well. So I think that's what I was trying to unpack there. Thanks.
Thanks, Leanne. Leanne, can I ask if you can maybe take the first shot of answering the question I posed, and then I'll also pass the mic to Irfaan to also give us his own perspective as well.
Simpi, can you just go over the first question that you asked?
Yeah, so the first question is, how do we as young people, especially living in rural areas or township areas, best approach the private sector to assist us towards the just transition?
Okay, so I mean, the private sector is inherently a part of our economy. They're delivering, you know, climate solutions, whether it be renewable energy technologies or, you know, you look at the mining sector, they're mining critical minerals, possibly not in the best way in all circumstances. But when it comes to network infrastructure, and you're thinking about them in the context of delivering against big renewable projects and their, you know, the IPP projects or water infrastructure. Of course, those things are done quite often, and you have public-private partnerships, but it's really important to look at the question of ownership. You really don't want to get into a space where the private sector ends up owning large network infrastructure. That is something to guard against. It's important also to think about the projects that are being rolled out under the JETP, for example. The private sector involvement is immense. And there you've got to ask the question, and you know, a lot of the JETP grant money, concessional finance, but a lot of grant funds are going to the private sector. And then you've got to ask questions about, okay, how do you ensure better equity in those circumstances? So the private sector is inherently involved in delivering against the solutions. We must think quite carefully about how do we interrogate the nature of those relationships and make sure we're not replicating the same systems, but in a renewable or green mineral, green economy, green industrialization context.
Thank you so much, Leanne. Irfaan?
Thank you. I think one of the first things I want to say is let's dispel this idea that the private sector is simply these big companies. The private sector is private business that also exists on our communities, the small business, the medium business, there's a printing business. All of those are private actors within this conversation. And us coming from townships, often those are the kinds of private business we interact with. Building partnerships with them, for me, starts on the premise that, one, recognizing that the challenges we faced are faced by them as well. And so recognizing their incentive is profit. Their incentive is to actually make money, and, you know, or for whatever means, whether they want to get rich, otherwise just want to live a comfortable life, etc., etc. And so, one, I'm not saying we must discourage, we in fact must encourage more business, more private companies, particularly from you as young people, to register and develop businesses. But it needs to be within a context that is progressively rising the rights of everyone. But the summit I went to in Brazil just recently, we had a mining company actually come to the summit and speak and engage us. And they have taken a very bold step within Brazil's context to actually rechange how they think about mining and engaging. Now, yes, many of you in this room will probably be anti-mining, or some of you will probably say, no, we should not engage the polluters. But the reality is we don't engage our friends only. In fact, our enemies must be engaged more, because that's the type of player in the room in which we need to be able to convince of why collectively we have a better outcome if we work together. And I think there is growing scope within the private sector to realize this. I'm finding it, at least in the last 2 to 3 years, that I am meeting with some business people who are saying, what and how could they approach it? And so there's an opportunity for teaching and bringing them along and not leaving them behind as well. So my take on this is that in the next few months, as we work towards G20 and Y20, we need to also look at which of the private sector leaders or entities have actually spoken or posted about climate issues. You know, the way companies post on like Freedom Day and Youth Day and so on. We must engage them and say, this is our demand, or these are our priorities as young people, and how do you help us achieve that? And so we can't keep going on the premise that
I don't go to the office.
Sorry, we can't keep going on the premise that we in this alone. We have to build allies, and allies exist in the private sector as well. And that means we need to work with them to find the solutions that make the most sense, realizing that while they are profit driven, we can also shape that profit into saying there's no profit making in a dead planet. And so it's about reshaping some of those narratives as well. I hope I made sense. Thank you.
Yes, you have. Thank you so much. I think in her absence, I'd just like to quickly thank Leanne for having been here today and having provided us with a lot of information on adaptation and how we look at adaptation on a local level. Bawa, I do see your hand is up again. Before I do allow you to speak, I just wanted to ask if anyone has any questions for Hannah, as she's also going to be hopping off in a few minutes. I do, so I'm going to ask mine in the meantime. And in terms of Y20, how do we as young people in South Africa ensure that we use the mechanisms that were mentioned before on holding people accountable, and with the suggestions that we then make towards Y20, how do we follow up after Y20 to hold leaders accountable, including ourselves as young leaders? Are there any other questions to Hannah before I allow her to answer?
Is it possible for me to ask?
Yes.
Boa.
Hi, Boa. Yes, it is possible for you to ask.
I'm going to ask it a bit differently. I'm going to say, how can I, as an old person, participate in a Y20? And specifically from a point, and I'll give my comment a bit later, but I am a father. I am employing youth, and I want to make a difference. So from our point of view, from a company Stroom, is we want to employ more than 2,000 youth doing green activities in townships. That's our mission. And so how can we also join in these activities, and how can we participate?
Thank you so much, Boa. I'm going to collect the one more question from Alexia for Hannah. Alexia, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And yeah, just a quick note to thank everyone who's spoken today and also participated in the chat function. I feel like I've learned a lot. Just a quick question, building on Simpiwe, your question is, I find that often engaging youth can be a bit of a tick box exercise when it comes, and sometimes it's just paying, lip service. So in order to make sure that as youth, we're being engaged like truly inclusively, and that our recommendations are actually carried through and translate into real tangible action. What can we do to ensure that that's the case, and to make sure that it's not simply something that's left or pushed to the wayside? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexia. Hannah, I hope you managed to note that. The floor is yours to provide us with some answers.
Thank you for the questions, everyone. I will try to address all of those in the 5 minutes I have left. Maybe just to start with Alexia's comment about youth engagement often being a tick box exercise. This is something as a delegate that I experienced, and often when I attend these sort of multilateral youth events, it's a frustration that I feel myself. So what we have tried to do in this year's Y20 is to address that by introducing the role of Sherpas. So each country will select a Sherpa, and we're going to try and set up an alumni network that will track the successes and failures of the Y20 engagement group, and how many policy recommendations are taken on board. So that will be a first step, I think, in the right direction. To be honest with you, a lot of the time, the work with the Y20 ends once the communique, which is a document containing all the policy recommendations, is handed over to the G20 leaders. And who knows what discussions happen behind closed doors, how much of that communique is actually taken into consideration in the bigger decision-making processes. I will say, though, that I have seen over the last 4 years of being involved in Y20 that a significant amount of policy recommendations actually have been passed. One of them being in 2021, one of our South African delegates put forward the idea of the African Union joining the G20, and it was passed. And that was a really significant moment. So although sometimes it may feel like we are just there to kind of take a photo and move on, we often do see some really significant wins. And I think the African Union joining is a huge win, especially because prior to that, South Africa was the only African country a part of the G20, and having to represent an entire continent. So I hope that answers your question there. The other question from, was it Boya?
Sorry, it's Bauer, but
Bauer.
Bauer, yeah.
Thank you for correcting me there. So maybe just to make sure that I understood your question, were you asking how people that don't fall in the bracket of youth can still support Y20? Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that is probably, that's, how can we participate? And also as a company that want to work in a green space and, etc., participate in and add value.
The biggest thing I would say is to fund us. Within my organizations, we're all volunteers, and Every year we try to get funding from big companies to support our delegates with their travel expenses to wherever the Y20 is happening or other big events, and it's always a struggle. So the first thing I would say is to financially support. But there are many other engagement groups for people outside of the bracket of youth that you can maybe look at. If you go onto the G20 South Africa website, you'll see that there's a number of engagement groups, and there's one focused specifically on climate. So that might be a space that you might be able to engage with a bit more. I hope that helps.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bo. Thank you so much, Hannah. There is one more question. I don't know if we can spare 1 more minute from you just for this last question that was asked, which was, how does LCOY ensure that it creates a system where youth is empowered to participate fully and authentically in the decision-making process, especially with the upcoming Y20, and be able to attend?
Well, that's a big question. So throughout this year, there are going to be a number of online events, in-person events that will be taking place where young people, whether they're a part of our working groups, engagement groups, or the delegation, will be able to attend. So I would say follow the Y20 South Africa social media pages and see where you can get involved. Unfortunately, our call for the working groups and engagement groups have already closed. But there will be other opportunities to engage, so please keep your eyes peeled. I'm happy to share the link to those pages in the chat before I go.
Thank you so much, Hannah. We will keep our eye out for those links. If you guys do have any more questions, Hannah has shared her email address with us. It's cochair1@y20southafrica.org. It is in the chat for anyone who has any further questions for Hannah. Are there any other questions that we do have on the floor? In the meantime, while people are still thinking about their possible questions, I'll just go back to our chats to see what we have there. We have another message from Obakeng who says, how can we carry on amplifying and spotlighting youth initiatives beyond the Y20 and G20? And then we have some comments from Boer again. And another question is, how is the World Bank helping Eskom with the Just Energy Transition Project? So those are the other 2 questions we have on the chat. Irfaan, it seems like you're our only other speaker who's able to answer for us at this moment. So maybe you can take on the 2 questions that I just read out from the chat.
I can't answer the last one. Apologies. I'm not as engaged in the climate space full time as many of you are. So which was the other question?
The other question was, give me a second to just scroll up back to it. How can we carry on amplifying and spotlighting youth initiatives beyond the Y20/G20?
So, part of the logic for this and why some of you may know the National Youth Coalition existed, or at least was a creation, many of us, was to make sure that there's a common space where we can all find links and connection. And so we can keep posting, and that group is quite active. There is thinking within the NYC to still build it further to make sure that there's space and common ground for young people to connect. So there's one way of doing it. My suggestion, though, is I know people are frustrated with WhatsApp groups. Often that's the good way to connect, especially if you administer it well and you can keep sharing initiatives as and when they come. Potentially using social media, building platforms where you share youth opportunities and engagements as they come. There are lots of them. Many of you have been beneficiaries of attending conferences. I myself have, because we follow those pages. So it's really your ability to network and engage. I will say beyond that, use official platforms. There's in the cities that you reside in. Often there's a youth desk in provinces, there's the NYDA. Yes, we can debate for a long time whether they're functional or dysfunctional, but those are spaces for you, and you have every right to make sure that they deliver. I see the hand popped up from Obake. I don't know if she has anything else to add to the question, but for me really it's what you make it. And so if you are in a community and you know 30 young people, even if you have no 5 people that you schooled with, you can have the opportunity to actually bring them closer and start from there. When we say power starts with you and youth, it starts with your ability to actually mobilize the people around you and start working from there. The Y20 is a space that will continue to have different engagements. I see Hannah just posted the LinkedIn and the social media handles. Follow those for the engagements that are coming up. But if your organization wants to host or invite leaders to engage, please reach out as well. I think a lot of the chairs and secretariat have been speaking. They also were Saya on a tour. So there's opportunities for you to also to invite other organizations in. In fact, I will also say, I might as well say it now, is that on Constitution Hill, we'll be hosting Saturday workshops. So if any of you have and are working with 16-year-olds, schools, or your NGO, please reach out. We'll be actually doing tours and training on Constitution fairly soon. So it's another opportunity for you to come through and engage.
Thank you so much. I just want to take this opportunity to just thank Hannah once again for having participated with us. Obake, do you still want to add more to the question that you asked?
Sorry, Simpiwe, I don't think it's a question, but rather a comment. I think from the youth engagements that I've attended, what I've started to pick up is that a lot of people working in the climate space or in just energy transition, a lot of the young people, we're working in isolations, right? We're working in our small little organizations or in our small little communities, but we're basically trying to solve the same problem. So I think when I asked about what work we're going to do beyond that is also trying to see if we can build a platform where all these youth organizations can have access to each other and we know who to connect with when we're working on specific initiatives, so that we're not all working on the same problem in isolation. I think when we do have the numbers, the impact will be bigger as well. So rather than seeing each other as competitors or working differently, separately, working together, I think would make an even bigger difference. Yeah, I think it's something we need to start thinking about, and it will help us move strategically as well to amplify the voices of young people.
Thank you so much, Obake. Are there any other questions on the floor? I'm also going to open up the floor for people to also ask questions to the ALCO organizing team, if anyone has any questions for them as well. Hopefully we'll be able to answer them. I saw that there was a comment from Courtney, but I have lost it and cannot find it.
Is it possible? Sorry, it's Bauer. My hand is up.
Hi, Bauer. Yes, sorry.
If it's okay, is there a minute still?
Yes, you may ask a question.
Yeah. So also a question, just a comment. I just want to encourage everybody. On the one hand, we need to fight. But on the other hand, especially as an older gentleman of a 16 and 18-year-old, I really want to, it gives great joy to assist youth, and that mentorship and participation and helping is, I think there's a lot of people, especially in the green space, that want to provide that. There is a lot of opportunities. It's a matter of connecting to that opportunities and have the ability to translate what you want to do to, actually capture that opportunity. I was fortunate enough to take my son with me to a presidential project with P4G in Vietnam, where the president of Vietnam hosted it. And Partnership for Growth is a very big organization. We actually had the president of the Resource Institute, the World Resource Institute, coming to our booth and talking to us, including some of our ministers and a whole lot. There is space for youth. I can say I took my son with, and the positivity of participants in that very big conference. When I hear someone is young and is participating in this environment is good and it's positive, and I think that momentum or that perspective is very important. And then just quickly from Stroom side, we are a local tech company manufacturing cargo e-bikes, and we manufacture more than 80% of that value here. And we are going to roll that with the ecosystem out in informal settlements, and it will happen on the basis of blending private and social impact type funding together to achieve it. So there's also very creative ways in doing and making a difference, and making a difference cost effectively, having environmental impact, doing youth employment, and that's probably the biggest thing. I worked for 18 years as a senior deal maker at the Industrial Development Corporation before starting Stroom and co-founding it. But yeah, the 2 points is youth there's a lot of people that want to help. It's very, very receptive in a green environment. And there's opportunities, and we need to be creative, and we're better than we think.
Thank you so much. I feel very motivated after hearing that. I'm not sure about anyone else. I also just want to read the 2 comments that are on the chat as well. From Lugani says, very true. I recognize this movement through your invitation. I'm assuming speaking about the National Youth Coalition, and only to realize it's something I can positively relate. We will continue our advocacy on just transition. And Tandile commented as well to say, yes, collaboration over competition. With that being said, are there any other questions, comments that want to add to the chat, want to raise our hands? Question mark. Sorry. Ketu, I do see your hand is raised. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Simpiwe. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you clearly.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. My name is Ketu, and I am from an organization called Enke Make Your Mark. And I just wanted to send a shout out to everyone. I am familiar with Mudiehi because I usually see her at the many youth capacitating events done by like a number of organizations. And I just wanted to say, like, as someone who is most recently starting in the social impact space, and more importantly in the green impact space, it's kind of like everything is starting to make sense. And so, like, shout out for these webinars and these events, and more importantly for all the networks that you're building, because yeah, it's getting brighter. So yeah, shout out.
Thanks, Ketu. Well, you got yourself a little special shout out over there. Courtney's asked a question to all the participants. Before I ask it, Boer, can I please ask, is that a legacy hand, or do you have another question or comment for us?
I'm not so good with the tech, so my son is not here. It's a legacy hand. Sorry about it.
No problem. Ketu, I'm going to assume that yours is also a legacy hand.
Yes. Let me lower it.
So the question to everyone from Courtney is, what are the most effective strategies for empowering youth to participate in local climate governance and policy making? I'll go first, and I'll say I think the most effective strategy for empowering youth is educating them, teaching them about the importance of being involved in climate action and climate governance and policy making.
Can I come in? Sorry. Yeah, I would say also with that, this education part is critical. But if we can employ youth and I can make a living while being green, that is, I'm pondering that question. And it provides economy, and so we are pondering the question of how can we employ and while being green and have a positive impact.
Thank you so much, Boer. Is there anyone else who would like to add on to this question?
Yes, it's a bold one. the best form of governments and governance by young people is to lead that governance structure. And so I think it should be a case in point of saying how many of you in 5 years' time occupy councillor seats, mayoral seats, MMC seats, because you are the people passionate about these issues. How do we get you to become, and there's many ways to do that. You don't have to go in a singular route. But I think that kind of ambition also helps transform governance, because leadership is a crisis worldwide. And if you are standing up as activists and leaders, the space to govern can be occupied by you. And so it's one of the clearest pathways to being effective in reshaping this governance structure. But also, I think policy making does and shouldn't exist in ivory towers or in boardrooms simply. Policy making is the everyday business of everyday people. And for you to shape the policy differently, you need to be able to build power. And I am of the opinion, just in this group alone, at least the 50 who attended, there's enough of you to put together policy briefs and keep hounding, build up a policy platform online that produces a monthly newsletter that helps reshape public discourse. Those are all avenues in which we can reshape thinking, because that's the kind of work people are not doing as much, particularly us as young people. We may do it because we are employed in jobs to do it, but I think outside of that, we need to find and build space, similar to how Hannah was saying. It's a volunteered space, but it's one that has effective outcomes, and we need to start thinking along those lines. Yeah, I think that's what I wanted to add to that point on local governance.
Thank you so much. We have also another addition from Mutandile, who says, giving youth the resources to lead builds confidence and shows their input matters. Completely agreed. Another one, from Boer, if there is any platform where Storm as a green logistics and circular economy manufacturer can play a role, please do let him know if there is. Another question that I'd also like to pose myself to the floor is, and this can just be top of your head for anyone who can take a knock at it. What innovative financial mechanisms, including public-private partnerships, can be employed at the local level to fund the just transition? I think I'll start with Irfaan as our guest speaker, if maybe you can give us an answer to that. And then if anyone else on the floor would also like to give a shot at it.
Please repeat the question. So I didn't catch it.
So the question is, what innovative financial mechanisms, including public-private partnerships, can be employed at the local level to fund the just transition?
What innovative mechanisms? I think we have existing infrastructure around where common meeting places happen. At a local level, you'll find there's a business forum, there's a committee, or at least a councillors committee, there's sports teams. I think we need to be able to find how we bring everyone in the same room with an agenda that is led by, one, this is the climate transition, two, this is how we envision it to unfold, and three, creating a space. And I think breaking away a bit from this mold where you just have 4 speakers and people listen and ask questions only. I think we need to build effective partnerships. You need to recognize the equality of each player. And that means when you're in that room, you are there as an equal part of this big pie. And instead of just having one person dominate, try to create it in a circular fashion so that everyone has a stake in it. It's something I think even in the democracy space is being pushed, so that we no longer rely on just this big man or this big brother type of approach with you speak, I listen, but we have a sense of equal stake in the decision making. I also think we need to press bigger and much more ambitious targets, particularly within spaces like NEDLAC. It's something that's not used enough. That's a common place between labor And so where the labor organizations in our discussions, often it's just private sector, and yet there's enough leverage within the labor movements to help us rethink how it must benefit workers and the working class as a priority. Yeah, that's it for me. I'm sure someone can add.
But your hand is up, so I'm gonna give the floor back to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think from what was interesting, we had and I'm saying we Stroom and together with the Stellenbosch Greater Stellenbosch Trust, had a very interesting discussion with the Just Energy Transition senior official. South African Just Energy Transition that's managed by the DTIC. And what came out of the discussion is we need to be very creative about how we can blend private and private capital, these special programs that comes out, and then things like social funds. So just give you an example, this Greater Stellenbosch Trust created 1,000 jobs, and a lot of them are green jobs where they use the social enterprise fund. And so from that social enterprise fund, we created 50 youth jobs as a trial, also in a green delivery space. And then things are coming up like the Jobs Fund, you have PPE Africa, there's a lot of these bigger funds, and they're actually seeking practical ways of implementing the funding into, practically implement it. But also with that is how can we bring it to, to employ youth and bring it back into our historically disadvantaged areas and really make a very practical change that brings economy growth, etc. So these are just a few examples. The Social Enterprise Fund, I think the Jobs Fund is a very interesting fund that is just opened, and players need to come together, and we will approach people to join us in possibly one of these big projects. So that is just my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Boer. I see that we have another prompt question in the chat from Courtney, which is, what are the most effective strategies for empowering youth to participate in local climate governance and policy making? And we have answers already. So Tandile says, sorry, this one we've already gone through. Oh, no, we haven't. While I sort out my own confusion, I just want to say thank you so much to Irfaan for having joined us. We really do appreciate all of the insights that you gave tonight for our conversation on localizing just transition and how climate change is a local issue. And we can please just give him a virtual round of applause. Thank you so much. So now that I've also managed to get a hold of my confusion. So the question is, what are the most effective strategies for empowering youth to participate in local climate governance and policy making? Tandile says, giving youth the resources to lead builds confidence and shows their input matters. Sharon says that being more active on an educational level with youth in schools and creating curiosity within the youth to want to be involved. And we have another question from Mo, which was, how can local governments effectively implement just transition policies, ensuring they are both sustainable and equitable? Answers are implement policies that protect vulnerable communities from economic shocks, and having the community and NGOs part of decision-making and discussions that the policies align with the needs of the people. Before I pass the mic on to Lerato, are there any other additions or comments that people would like to make either to the two questions that were posed by Mo and Courtney on the chats? You can either add your comments on the chats, or you are more than welcome to raise your hand and take the floor. There's about 2 minutes left of our Q&A session. So use it now effectively if we ever hold your peace. No more questions, no more comments, no more thoughts, no more shout outs. Well, we actually have another comment from Andile that says, and this is answering Mo's question, which was, How can local governments effectively implement just transition policies, ensuring they're both sustainable and equitable? And Andile said, by investing in green job skills, training, and social protections that prioritize vulnerable communities. Equitable implementation also requires transparent funding, data-driven decision-making, and accountability mechanisms tailored to local realities. Thank you, Andile. With the last minute that I have with me, I will pass the floor over. Oh, wait, sorry, before I do that, let me read out Tandile's response, which is to use social media, messages, and videos to share info and ask for their input. The youth doesn't always go to long meetings, but they are online every day, which is true. Social media activism is another form of activism that is up on the rise for a lot of young people. And now I can officially pass the floor on to Lerato Maloka for closing remarks and to give us more information about what happens after webinar 2. Lerato, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you so much, Simpiwe, for that entrance into my VOT as well as the announcement. So I'd first like to thank the following people, our wonderful presenters, Hannah from the Y20, Irfaan from We the People, and of course, Leanne from Southern Transitions. I'd also like to give an honorable mention or special thank you to everyone coming from Ekurhuleni, Joburg, Solomondale, Giyani, Cape Town, Secunda, Midrand, Mamelodi, Mahikeng, Montana, Eastern Cape, Soweto, Embalentle, and many more places. This is everyone that has also commented on the chats, everyone that has been engaging, and just a few takeaways before I can do the announcement of webinar 3. Yes, Ketu, I'm here. I'd really like to emphasize how important it is as young people within the room that we are not powerless. There's many things we can do. There's many initiatives we can join. And to echo Wageng's words, working in silos has never really worked for anyone, or at least for the broader picture, for the broader goal. We should use the tools that we have, use the Constitution. We should also continue to educate our communities, other young people as well, about climate literacy, because that's a huge hindrance in a lot of communities. Active citizenship, mobilizing and educating, as well as knowing your municipal council wards, and attending these meetings so that you can answer the question of the day, which was, what is the most urgent climate action need in our local communities? So you can provide insight once you start attending such meetings. And of course, South Africa's G20 presidency and the Y20, how we can all try to be involved in that, following their social media and other platforms so that we can also have a word in there, see what the processes look like. For those who have been following the call, I forgot what it's called, but the call for interest, I think, and as well as the delegate participation. Shout out to you, and I hope you guys make it so that you can represent and just get the participation in the broader message going as well. And with that being said, I'd like to also encourage everyone to follow our social media pages. Sorry. We are basically almost everywhere, okay? We haven't tapped into TikTok yet, but we are coming. But for now, you can follow our social media pages, namely the Facebook page, Instagram, LinkedIn, which is LCOY South Africa. Just click LCOY South Africa and chances are you are going to see our logo, our page. And you can also find us on our new website, LCOY South Africa, and of course one of our media partners, which is Voices of Mzansi. Follow their website, and there's a web page there with the LCOY South Africa team. So yeah, we also have a YouTube page. Some of the recordings will actually be shared on the YouTube page, so you can also go back just to get a sense of, for those who have missed webinar 1, for example, just so that you can recap on what exactly webinar 1 was all about. And speaking of webinars, we have had webinar 1, and today was webinar 2, and introducing webinar 3. So webinar 3 is basically going to build on. Webinar 3 is going to be the one you shouldn't miss at all, because this one, we will not be doing a talk shop. You guys will be the ones who will basically like talking and discussing. There will be a simulation as well. So webinar 3 is definitely not the webinar to miss out. More information, of course, will be shared on our social media platforms. And with that being said, thank you, thank you, thank you. And yeah, Miss Facilitators and Piwe, I tried to match your energy, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Lerato.
Sorry, Simpiwe. I'm so sorry. I knew I forgot something. So webinar 3, thank you, Lundi, is actually on the 8th of May. Thank you.
Thank you, Lerato. So as mentioned, webinar 3 is on the 8th of May. It's going to be a lot more interactive, so everyone needs to definitely be there. And also, please catch webinar 1 and 2's recording on the YouTube channel, as we were just told by Lerato. With that being said, thank you so much to every single person who attended from 5 to 7 on a Thursday evening in the middle of public holidays in South Africa. We appreciate it. And this just shows that we really are all committed towards a greener future and a proper just transition. So please also give yourselves a virtual round of applause, or an actual round of applause if you are at home by yourself and you can just go, yay. Thank you so much. It is 7 o'clock. Please enjoy the rest of your evening, everyone.